Hello, and welcome to the Lend Hope in Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys, and I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 2, and we'll be talking about what is the Mutuum. I took a Twitter poll, and it seemed that 4 of the 7 people who responded were interested in hearing more about usury. So I thought I'd go down that route, and then we can look at some of the other topics, like time value of money, inflation, theories of value, and kind of go from there. So, in the last episode, I talked about what usury is, especially going back through the tradition. And the definition that we see arising out of the tradition is exacting profit from a mutuum. Now, there's 3 key terms that we need to keep in mind in this definition, and it's exacting, profit, and mutuum. So exacting here is just obligating or requiring in the agreement. So it involves this kind of obligation. So it's not explicitly theft or robbery in the way that you might just steal something, but it's this obligation. But it also might include something that's not formally or explicitly in the contract, but a requirement of some sort, even informally. Often this was to avoid the appearance of usury, and so it's still usurious. The second term is profit, and this is anything over the principal. The way that this is talked about is increment, addition, superabundance over the principal. And that this goes throughout a lot of the tradition as well. There is some ambiguity there because of extrinsic titles, which we can talk about later, but the third term is what I want to focus on today, which is the mutuum. So, similar to usury, there's a great deal of disagreement about what exactly a mutuum is. So, you have people like Belloc and McCall who talk about it as something along the lines of a loan for consumption. That this is something that you give money to someone else so that they can then go buy something that they're going to consume, like food. So that's one definition. A loan of fungibles is another one. So the idea here is you're loaning something that can be replaced in kind. So you can replace, for example, like kindling for a fire, but you can't replace the Dead Sea Scrolls, even though they might be usable and were used as kindling for fire. Another one is a loan of consumptibles or consumables. And the idea here is kind of going along the lines of Aquinas' argument, which is not exclusive to him, but that usury involves this consumption as well. And so kind of differentiating from Belloc's and McCall's position, where this is a loan to go buy something for consumption, this is a loan of something consumed. Sometimes this has been put in terms of consumed in first use as compared with more durable things. But each, these last two specifically kind of focus around what is the thing consumed, the nature of the thing loaned. So some authors have mixed up fungible and consumable, saying that anything that is fungible is consumable. And this is a particular area of confusion because not everything that is fungible is consumable and vice versa, at least in a conventional sense. So, for example, screws are fungible, but they're not necessarily consumable in kind of these conventional senses. for whatever reason, people kind of mix up consumable and fungible. And a lot of these kind of make sense within some of the traditions. So in Roman law, the Justinian Institutes defines, the mutuum specifically in terms of something that is consumed in its very use. And the examples it gives are wine, oil, corn, money, copper, silver, gold, which might be a little confusing because how is copper, silver, and gold consumed? But this is the kind of idea that it's arising from. Mutuum is often translated as loan for consumption, so there's also that kind of limitation as far as the translation. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, Aquinas really focuses on consumption, and sort of a prima facie perspective might give that idea that the mutuum is about consumption, or that it's about consumables, for example. But I want to propose a different perspective, and I'm going to be drawing on Roman law, the tradition, just the way it was historically treated, and then finally looking at some of the magisterial documents to understand, well, how is the church looking at this contract? So I'm going to give away the story and just say the mutuum is a personally secured loan. And if you read anything or listened to me before, you'll know that this is the position I take, and I think it's the most coherent and most defensible position. But the first point I'd like to make is that outside of discussions of usury, this seems to be entirely uncontroversial. Like, no one really disputes this. It's only when in discussing usury that I've gotten any pushback on this. Like, how dare I define the mutuum in this way? And which is always very confusing because I'm pointing at the way other people are defining it. So let's kind of start with explaining the difference between a personally secured debt or an asset secured debt. So with an asset secured debt, this is kind of most obvious in terms of the way default is handled. So in an asset secured debt, there's going to be some sort of property that's put up to secure the debt. And this means that in the case of default, the lender can pursue that asset, take it as his own and sell it in order to recover the principal. Now, there's a couple of different cases. Either the asset covers that principal or it doesn't. So if it covers it, he's good. If he doesn't, though, so if it doesn't completely remit that debt, he doesn't have any further rights or claims to further pursue the recovery of his principal, because his claim is limited to this property. And that, I think, is what most clearly distinguishes the asset secured debt from the personally secured debt, is that the claim that the lender has is definitionally reduced to this property, the specified property in the contract. And so it's a limited kind of claim. In the personally secured loan, what happens is, in the case of default, the lender can pursue the borrower personally, so he can go after all of his own other goods. And so when that principal is not met, he can start taking his other property, or in modern times, garnishing his wages. And so this is where the personally secured debt is unlimited in its claim. because there's no specific property that kind of boxes it in, he has this unlimited claim against the borrower to recover his principal. And so this is kind of what distinguishes the two. Now, in Roman law, from what I've seen, I'm not an expert in Roman law, but this sort of distinction is laid out. So there is a distinction between an action or right in Roman law that is in rem, in a thing, versus in personam, in a person. And so this means that the action in rem is you have some sort of claim over a thing, and so it involves a right over that thing that potentially involves everyone else. For example, like your ownership of a thing, it potentially involves every other person because it's this exclusive right, and so you can potentially exercise that right against anyone. Now, in personam means you have a right or an action against a specific person, and for example, in these kind of debt cases, you have an action against the person in the case of non-performance of the contract. So, for example, default. So if the other person fails to perform their portion of the contract, and this arises in every contract in Roman law, then you can take action against them. Another example would be in the societas. There's some in personam actions where you can actually pursue the traveling merchant, for example, depending on what they did. So there is this kind of distinction already present in Roman law. So it's not just coming out of nowhere. For the Mutuum specifically, this gives rise to what is called a condictio action, which is a in personam action that allows the lender to pursue the borrower specifically for the return of the principal. And there's no other actions or rights granted to the lender. So it's a singular right over the borrower. So we already see here that this in Roman law, the Mutuum, seems to be a right in personam. So it seems to be secured by the person, by his promise, to return the principal. If we look at St. Ambrose, the way in the De Tobias, the way that he talks about the Mutuum and how it was executed in Roman society, it sounds very much like a personally secured debt. So if you were unable to pay your debt, you could potentially be sold into slavery. Your family could be sold into slavery. All your goods could be taken. That's just simply what a personally secured debt is. People could be, you could pursue all the goods of the person. And I mean, slavery in particular kind of gives this idea of, yeah, this is really secured by the person of the borrower. And he even talks about how people are potentially reduced to destitution and commit suicide over usury. So this isn't a limited thing. The usurer keeps coming for you, taking everything you have ultimately. So in another work by Dr. Rayerson, she studies the medieval practice in the French city of Montpellier, and what she specifically says is that the Mutuum loan was generally guaranteed by the borrower with obligation of person and goods. So again, here we see that this practice of the Mutuum was guaranteed by the borrower. And she talks about specifically how debtors, when defaulting, were put into debtor's prison until they paid the whole principal off. So again, we see this pursuit of the borrower, that personally secured nature. Now, Father Patrick Cleary, in his book Usury or the Church in Usury, discusses this as well. And kind of just in passing, he just says, well, the loan, the Mutuum loan it involves a personal claim. He says, in a contract of loan or Mutuum, the lender is not the owner of the good, but he has a personal claim on the debtor for the amount. So there is this personal claim. This is one of the only places I've seen where usury is being discussed and the personal claim is explicitly admitted, at least in modern times. So again, there's that personal claim. Now, looking at St. Thomas Aquinas, I think this is important because St. Thomas is such a prominent figure, as we want to understand, well, what does he think the Mutuum is when he's discussing this? So, in the question on usury, in the second part, question 78, Article 2, response to the 5th, he says that the borrower holds money at his own risk and is bound to pay it all back. So, here again, he is bound to pay it, regardless of what happens to the property, because he has it at his own risk. So if the property is completely lost, he still has to repay that. Looking back to the commentary on the sentences, he also talks about the manner in which a lender should not profit from the industry of the borrower. So if the borrower makes something more from it through his industry, the borrower or the lender should not have claim to that. But he also says the lender ought not try to sell him his own industry, just as neither ought the borrower to have less because of his foolishness. So if the borrower foolishly loses all the property, the lender should not have to suffer less. So again, this is that appearance of this requirement that the borrower has to repay the whole thing, regardless of the loss of property. Now, there's a further kind of interesting passage that I found, several months ago, I think, and it has to do with Aquinas is discussing the old law and whether the juridical injunctions were fitting or sufficient. And so one of them is he considers the Jubilee. And so what he says here is that, and this is the Summa, the first part of the second part, question 105, Article 2, response to the 4th. Here he's talking about the forgiveness of debts. And so he says that very likely after 7 years, either the debtor will already have repaid his debt, or he'll be insolvent. And this insolvency is interesting because by admitting the insolvency, that means this debtor doesn't have anything to his name, or at least he doesn't have anything sufficient to pay. So maybe he still has, the clothes on his back and food. But and what he says is, but if they were altogether insolvent, the borrower, there was the same reason for remitting the debt from love for them, as there was for renewing the loan on the account for their need. Now, the key here is that the lender should remit the debt from love, rather than the debt being remitted in virtue of his insolvency, or really that the insolvency just brought an end to the contract. So the lender actually has to kind of forgive the debt, even though the debtor has nothing. And so here we see, again, the borrower has nothing. He's insolvent, but he's still obligated to pay the return. The lender has to actually forgive the debt, and Aquinas is saying, forgive it from love. And juridically, in the Jubilee, it was something that should be forgiven. And this is an important part of the Mutuum as an act of charity. That really, if your friend who you gave the Mutuum to is worse off at the time of repayment, you should lend hoping nothing in return. That is, in your charity, you should forgive even the principal if he can't repay it. And that's been one way to interpret that passage from Luke. So this is kind of some of the perspectives over time. St. Thomas Aquinas being one of the prominent doctors of the church to consider. The next, I want to move into the magisterium. What has the church said about this? And it's been very interesting. So over time, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a lot of financial innovation. So the commercial revolution was kind of picking up speed. And there's new contracts coming out. So, and even they had to deal with older contracts as well. One of the main contracts that they were addressing was the medieval census, and this goes back like very far, like the 10th century at least. So the census contract was this agreement where the owner of some property would sell a claim over his goods, his fruitful goods, and the purchaser would essentially sell it back to him. And so the transaction was kind of that, like from a financial perspective, that the purchaser would give the seller a lump sum of money, and then the purchaser would receive a claim over that property that would give him a portion of the fruits or rents of the property. And so Pope Callistus III discusses this, and he talks about real estate, for example. So if you have some sort of rental property or farms and things, the idea was that you're selling this portion of this property from which you can derive a claim to the fruits that are actually produced from the property. And this is the way he kind of talks about it. This one in particular is very likely infallible because the Pope is discussing an issue of faith and morals. He invokes his apostolic authority, and I think it's outside his jurisdiction as the primate of Italy. So there's good reason that it meets the criteria of infallibility. And so what he says here with the census is that the buyer of the census has a claim to these rents, these fruits of the good. But if that property that is the underlying basis of that is brought to utter destruction, then the buyer would not be empowered. He wouldn't have a claim to recover even the price he paid, even that principal that he put forward. And so this is very clearly an asset recourse or an asset secured debt of some sort. And so specifically the question he's dealing with is someone was claiming that the census that he had sold was actually usurious, and so he didn't want to pay the rents. And so the Pope here is saying, no, this isn't usurious. here's one of the things about it. And so this is kind of telling us something of the nature of agreements that are not usurious. So asset recourse loans are not usurious, is what we can kind of derive from this. But the question then is, well, what is usurious? And we know that any contract that is usurious is a mutuum, because the mutuum is that sort of material component of the act, similar to the way that killing a human is the material portion of murder. Killing an innocent person is what's formally murder, and so exacting profit specifically from a mutuum is usury. So in this case, the contract is allowing for some profit. It is not usurious. Therefore, there is not a mutuum in this contract. So then we move to another papal document written by St. Pius V, which is called Cum Onis. This one potentially also may have the mark of infallibility as well, because he does invoke his apostolic authority. The issue, though, is that it very obviously has certain components of like a positive law perspective. Like he lays out certain periods of time and things that have to be met, like the borrower or the seller of a census has to provide at least a year's notice. But here he specifically says, and he's condemning usurious contracts. So Callistus was doing the opposite. He was saying a contract that was claiming to be usurious was not. Here, Pius is condemning usurious contracts, and he says that in the census, it has to be grounded in some sort of immovable property that is fruitful in itself. So we're talking about some sort of real estate here. And so he specifically says, if it's not grounded in this, it's usurious. And so he's kind of dealing with a contract that arose called the personal census, where people would sell a census against their own labor or all their goods generally. So this had kind of the sense of a mutuum, because it was this personally secured type of contract. And so he goes on very similar to Callistus, but this time he's condemning usurious contracts, and he says, if the property is reduced to destruction, if the rents are lost, the seller is not obligated to pay that, or he's only obligated to pay in proportion to the property being destroyed. So if it's only partially destroyed, then those rents are also partially reduced. If it's utterly destroyed, then it's all gone. And so very clearly here he's again, setting that asset secured is not usurious, but also he's condemning these contracts which are personally secured. So when the seller has to personally guarantee the payment of these rents, the return of the principal, that's when the problem is. That's when it's usurious. That's what he's condemning. So he's very much in line with Callistus here, but he's kind of taking the next step, whereas Callistus only tells us what is not usurious. Pius is telling us what is usurious, and he's condemning it. Now, one of the things we might consider is that maybe this just has something to do with the census contract. But what we see here in another papal document by Sixtus V in De Testabilis Avaritia. He is talking about the triple, something like what was known as the triple contract. So in the triple contract, the idea was, at least the way it was explained or justified, was that you had a partnership agreement, so a societas. Combined with that, the investing partner would enter into an insurance contract on the principal. So his principal was guaranteed by this insurance contract. In addition to that, the profits that the investing partner was also insured. So there's a second insurance contract there as well. And so the way that this was justified was, well, a societas is a partnership, that's licit. An insurance contract, that's licit. So if you just push them all together, then the whole thing is licit. There's some problems with that, of course, but let's kind of focus on what Sixtus has to say. So again, Sixtus is going to condemn this sort of contract. And so he condemns this sort of partnership where the managing partner or has to personally guarantee the principal and the profits, such that even if all the goods that they own jointly are destroyed. So even so the way he says it is that even by mere accident or injury, loss, damage, the whole principal and capital are destroyed, the managing partner has to restore it in full and safely. And he goes on that the managing partner is obligated by this pact or promise to restore everything in full, even if it's all destroyed. So again, we kind of we go back to Callistus, who is saying, yeah, if the whole of the property is destroyed, in illicit census, the purchaser is not empowered. He doesn't have that right to pursue the seller. And so here, the investing partner does not have the right to pursue the managing partner to get his principal and property back. The interesting thing here also is that Sixtus V specifically condemns proceedings against the managing partner for the return. So he's specifically condemning this notion of a deficiency judgment, which is pursuing any missing of that principle. And he's condemning this all as usury. So since these type of contracts are usurious, what this entails is that these sort of components are what make a mutuum, and the problem is that he's trying to take the purchaser is trying to take his profit as well. And so this gives the idea that this is the way that the magisterium is thinking about it. That Pope Callistus, Pope Sixtus, Pope Pius are all thinking about usury in this personally secured way. And this is extremely important because once we understand where usury is, what kind of contract it arises under, then we can start to talk about and determine where usury is, because that's where a lot of the confusion lies. So, and a lot of the excuse of usury as well. So, I think that's good for today. We're a little over time, but thank you for listening today. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me questions, comments at lendhopingnothing@gmail.com. And I'll have all of the show notes along with the quotes and links down below. So thank you, and thanks for listening.